Welcome to IdeaMix Performance and Wellness, where world-leading coaches and scientists explain how their research can help you achieve your personal and professional goals faster.
Hi, it's Jayanti, co-founder and CEO of IdeaMix Coaching. Coaching's played an important role in my life. It's helped me through my journey to become a powerful leader, mother, and wife. IdeaMix coaches help you increase your self-awareness, improve your problem-solving skills, and evolve your habits to achieve your goals. All things I'm grateful to have learned and done through my own coaching journey. Our easy 1-minute assessment matches you with an IdeaMix coach that best fits your needs and values. Each IdeaMix coach is vetted and experienced and helps clients map and achieve their wellness, professional, and business goals. If you or someone you know could benefit from coaching, visit our website at www.theideamix.com. We also know that not everyone can invest in coaching right now, and that's why we provide free coaching in our Coach Shorts episodes. If you think someone you know would benefit from it, please share our podcast with them. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.
Welcome to this episode of the IdeaMix podcast. We're excited today to be chatting about soft skills, what they are, why they're important, how people develop them, and why they're increasingly relevant for each individual at every stage of their lives.
Great. Shall we get started?
Let's dive in.
So our first question is to sort of lay the landscape. I always like to start with a definition of how we're thinking about these things. So let's discuss what are soft skills?
I think two words that are core to the idea of soft skills, in my view, and I think this shows up a lot in the research as well, are empathy and persuasion, right? And when you think of anybody in an interactive context, definitely at work, but just in life in general, if we're not able to exhibit those two qualities of being able to connect with other people, relate to what they're actually telling us, the empathy piece, and if we're not able to persuade them as to our point of view or to do something that we want them to do, it's pretty hard to navigate the world without those two qualities.
Yeah, it's the way, basically, those are very critical skills for how we interact with other people. I also like to maybe broaden our definition a little bit, and it's also about how we self-manage, in the sense of, in order to be able to practice empathy, we have to also be able to identify what feelings we feel in a situation and how then we respond or don't respond to a certain situation or certain behavior pattern of somebody else.
I think that's a great point, right? This sort of idea of self-awareness and being able to unpack and understand and analyze our own thought process and reactions to understand how we're feeling, what we're feeling, or why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really, obviously, if you reading in the literature out there, soft skills can cover a much broader array of what people talk about: communication and leadership and collaboration, all basically skills in the way we think of them, where, as you're saying, empathy, persuasion, and self-management are critical to how they unfold, basically. But, I always like to differentiate skills from, okay, these are soft skills. What is not a soft skill? So we think of maybe a software developer doing programming, for example. That is not a soft skill.
Right.
You can probably take an online course and learn how to program, or learning a foreign language. You're learning a vocabulary, you're learning phrases, you're learning very concrete information.
Technical knowledge.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That may change, but not really. Whereas soft skills require a level of adaptive behavior to the situation.
Totally agree with you. I mean, the analogy it's sort of brought up in my mind, Jamie, as you were explaining this idea, is why do we, as parents, encourage our children to play a team sport? One of the reasons is that it forces them to develop these skills of empathy and persuasion, right? Because without the ability to communicate effectively with, relate to, work collaboratively with the other members of that team, their skills don't become better, the game doesn't work as well, the team doesn't win, there's so many knock-on effects. And similarly, in a professional context, the most valuable work in organizations, and so much of the business research bears this out, happens in teams. It does not happen with single individuals, right? Of course, they're very talented single individuals, but the really valuable work in a business endeavor happens when teams come together and then learn to do something very well.
And collaborate.
Yeah.
To solve a problem, rise to a challenge, whatever it is that you're trying to solve. Yeah, and I think that really gets at sort of why are soft skills now increasingly more important. And in fact, there's a World Economic Forum labor report about what are the most in-demand skills for the workforce for 2025, and we see soft skills showing up in many of the top 15 that they had identified. Adaptability, flexibility, creative thinking, problem solving, communication, all these things that, typically when you are a student in a traditional school environment or even at university, you're not necessarily learning.
So that's a great question. Do we feel our educational system teaches these soft skills?
I mean, no. No, I would land on no.
I like that. Very direct.
I would land on no here. And, the moral that I have understood the world of coaching and the benefits of coaching, it's clear to me that there is this gap in what we call education around what we say we value and then what we actually then ask our students to do in a traditional school environment. And, I think this gets at sort of one of the challenges with soft skills is how do you measure them? So in a traditional academic environment, we've got tests, kids get scores, they can know how much knowledge of X, Y, and Z they have by how they performed on a quiz and on tests. But then how do you measure how much empathy a child has? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that.
So maybe the contrast, which is interesting, is that in a professional context and in the world of coaching, in much of the work that we do, we use a series of assessment tools, whether that's 360s, whether it's assessments that focus on emotional intelligence, that are a framework for helping to measure or at least develop some quantifiable barometer of a person's soft skills, right? Relative to their peers, relative to their team, relative to similar individuals in that kind of role. And that's deeply useful, right? In an academic context, we never measure those things, right? We say it all day long that we want our children, to be a certain way
Team
and
player.
so on. Right, but it's never rewarded, right? And when something is neither measured nor concretely rewarded, I think it's very hard to transmit that it should be near the top of the list in terms of the types of skills that our children are trying to acquire.
Yeah, your point about the incentive structure that exists is quite important. And I was listening to this other podcast the other day that talked about how, oftentimes organizational psychologists talk about the awareness behavior gap. And the reason why a certain leader may pound the table about doing a certain thing and then not do it themselves is because at the end of the day, there's no reward in doing it, which is quite interesting. So that's a systemic problem, right? We have to change then how we reward people if we want them to actually focus on developing these skills. Competition gets rewarded with first place, with the, straight A's, with all this stuff. And then it then gets externalized and people get praised and you're smart, you're this, that. Nobody gets praised for being empathetic. Right? You don't ever hear anybody talking about straight A for empathy.
Right. It's just not measured.
A
or
for
value.
persuasion. Yeah, exactly. There's no reward system actually, whether it's in school. And quite frankly, I almost feel even in the work environment today, people, particularly in certain industries, they get paid based on their productivity, right? And their output, not on were they a team player? Did they help? Were they collaborative? A lot of organizations just don't measure that stuff when they're thinking about bonuses.
I think this is why, right, in our business, we've seen such an increase in the need and demand for coaching at companies, because I think, as you were just saying, from the starting point from the lowest kind of entry-level job in an organization to the point when someone is actually managing a team, what's being measured and what's being rewarded is technical skills, right? In finance, did they build the model right? Do they understand the financial complexity of a transaction, whatever that is. And it's only once an individual is put into a position of managing a team that then these soft skills come so much to the fore, because now they're not doing the work themselves, but they're actually trying to persuade a set of people to do these things in whatever way they want to do them. And if they're not empathetic towards the members of that team, it's very hard to get anywhere, right?
Yeah.
And I think the other piece is that these skills are absolutely teachable. We've built an educational system that is entirely geared to teach technical skills, which totally made sense in a kind of industrializing society. And now in this post-industrial world, we're still in that old educational system, but in this new world, we're not focused on teaching these soft skills. So people aren't coming into the workforce having acquired them. Some of them have them naturally, and that stands them in very good stead. But for the vast majority of people, learning is a lifelong thing, and we all need an assist with furthering our learning that starts with self-awareness and then moves on to development and change.
Absolutely. I want to go back to the idea of the assessment here, and how assessments, I think, can be really helpful in that development process. I think the way that I think about specific assessments that sort of assess personality in particular, and what they look at is, how do you show up naturally? What is your innate ability in a certain circumstance or in a certain situation? That being said, even if your natural ability in a specific situation is X, it does not mean that you can't learn to bring something else to the table. Because in actuality, all of us are made up, we're very complex. Human beings are very complex. And we actually have the capability of, being X in one situation and Y in a different situation. We're actually really reactive to situations and people.
Yep.
And the whole idea behind these assessments is to say, this is your innate ability, this is how you typically show up, what you typically do, what you're typically motivated by. But then it's like, okay, but certain circumstances require this. So then how can we, with a coach, practice getting this skill and making this become, in these particular circumstances when you need them, how can you help that skill show up? And when I think about this, I often think about competition is really useful in certain situations. But knowing when competition is appropriate, we don't teach our kids that. And I feel like you have a lot of kids, because we come out of a traditional school environment where it is super competitive. They just always show up competitive because that's what they've been taught to do. When in fact, there are situations where being collaborative is how you're gonna get the best outcome. But we're not teaching our kids that.
Sort of every nail does not require a hammer,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I also think there's a really interesting study. It was a 2020 Yale University study, and what it found was that when leaders of teams, no matter how small or large, are emotionally intelligent, to go back to that empathy and persuasion point, they were, number one, themselves happier, more innovative, more creative individuals in their work. But number two, that 70% of the team members who worked with those individuals, when they were short on emotional intelligence, were unhappy and negative about their work, right? It's such a sort of cancerous thing that transmits throughout a team when the leader is not able to illustrate and manifest empathy and persuasion in their work. And I mean, those numbers are sort of fascinating, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think, so much of what happens in terms of soft skill learning now is through mentorship and through modeling, right?
Right.
But
that's very idiosyncratic, right? And not a repeatable system in the way that coaching is.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then you think in a hybrid or remote working environment, how much more challenging that mentorship piece, that modeling piece becomes.
Yeah.
Because you're not in the office all the time, and there's a lot of sort of natural interactions that you're right are not replicable, not happening.
Yeah.
So I think it's we're going to we see much more of a need for leaders who are very have a very high level of soft skills,
right,
and then can translate those soft skills through video chat.
Yeah.
And to a model where not everybody's in the office all the time.
Right.
And I believe you've always had a little bit of this, because we have had global organizations for a while, but not to the extent that we're seeing now.
Yeah. And I think for young professionals who have entered the workforce over this last, sort of post-pandemic period, right, or even before that, when they were in remote and hybrid work environments, which are popular because of the obvious convenience, the lack of those in-person interactions has really hampered their development on this soft skills piece, which is sort of essential, right? As I was thinking about getting ready for this podcast, Jamie, I came across a woman who's a futurist, and she's a writer, and she talked about this idea of career durability. And the idea was that if someone does not develop the ability to learn the knowledge, the skills, the mindset that's required to remain an engaged and productive member of a team, then they sort of hit a wall, right? Because when you're a young professional and you don't develop that muscle memory, you are sort of depriving yourself of a resource to enable yourself to adapt to a new job, a new team, a new situation, a crisis, and whatever that is. Super interesting.
I mean, it's also, just think about how much you learn when you approach an individual with curiosity, and as each individual having a story behind what you see on the outside. Just think about like the growth and learning that comes from those interactions, right? And you basically, if you don't have that curiosity and you don't find the way to connect with people in a team environment, I do think it just stunts your growth effectively as a contributing member. I mean, and the reality is we've become culturally much more specialized, right? There's a lot of emphasis on specialty, but we really still need the bridges to bring the specialties together to actually be solving problems.
Right.
And that's where this sort of team mentality and interpersonal skills and collaboration really become valuable, particularly I think to organizations.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all now, I think I sort of feel like we're exhausting the shipping and production overseas, and where cost is we race to the bottom with cost. It's actually the people and how they function together for organizations that's going to make a difference.
Totally. Well, one of the dirty little secrets of offshoring has been that the process of trying to manage offshore teams has been incredibly hard. The process of trying to train the managers locally who are managing those offshore teams has been incredibly hard, right? And proven expensive, thereby sort of undermining the cost, race to the lowest cost analysis that drove a lot of those decisions. And so, I always feel, this is true of so many things in life, it's like beware of the unintended consequences, right? The unintended consequence of a young professional working mostly remotely is the lack of development of these soft skills that come from the people interactions.
Yeah.
The unintended consequences of the offshoring is, hey, it turns out it's really hard to manage someone who's sitting in the Philippines from New York, you know?
And also has a very completely different cultural context,
right,
as well.
Right, totally.
I find it actually really interesting. You had mentioned you had read an article by a futurist.
Yeah.
One of my favorite futurists is Yuval Harari.
Yeah.
Who, I'm not sure for those of you out there if you've read any of his books, but he's well known for *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus*. Which actually is the one that I read. And, I as we were thinking about the soft skill piece, I remembered in his book how he talks about the reason, his theory for why humans became dominant was because our ability, the dominant animal, the dominant species, right? Is it because of our ability to collaborate?
Right.
And, so I think that it really, this soft skills piece is really going to be the sort of the way to become the dominant companies and get the wins, is to figure out how to put the pieces of people together and make them the center of the organization and the culture.
No, that's so true. I mean, I often when we think and talk about coaching, my mind always goes to sports, right? And when you think about creating a basketball dream team, right? Which do you think performs better? Is it a team comprised of 5-star players who are all amazing individually in whatever set of skills are required? Or is the team that has complementary skills, communicates well, and knows how to collaborate the more successful one? And time after time, right, the answer is always the more collaborative team. Yeah. And across every sport, in every discipline, this model of, if we just put a bunch of stars in the room, they'll get it done, has been tried, and it's never actually worked.
Yeah. I'm actually remembering, I don't know if you watched Ted Lasso or anybody out there watched Ted Lasso, but that's the ultimate example is how highly criticized he was for not having the technical background of the game, and his whole approach was getting the team to work together as a team, which did bring them to victory.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think maybe as an end note, something that's worth highlighting is there's a ton of ongoing research on this topic of soft skills. Some of what it's revealed is that while companies realize that in the recruitment of individuals who are capable of leading teams, soft skills are super important, right? But what hasn't yet happened is that the recruiting function hasn't found a data-driven, repeatable process in terms of how to recruit these leaders, so much of the work that we do also focuses on this, right? Like, how do you make a relative assessment between a few candidates that on paper are all equally qualified for the job? Mm-hmm. What is the distinguishing feature? It becomes the soft skills.
Yes.
Time after time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And it is possible to get at those soft skills through the variety of, robust industry standard assessment tools that are now out there. And so it's, we're very much at the beginning of that process of evolution, I think, of companies understanding how to assess soft skills and then recruit based on that.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And it's just going to be more and more important. So from, having the lay of the landscape is going to be really crucial, again, for your organizational success.
Yeah. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe wherever you listen and leave us a review. Find your ideal coach at www.theideamix.com. Special thanks to our producer, Martin Maluski, and singer-songwriter Doug Allen.